Pine Camp, New York. January 20, 1944. Morning frost covers the parade ground. Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Simonson stands before a collapsed heap of gray rubber that, according to the requisition forms, is supposed to be an M4 Sherman tank. The thing weighs 93 pounds. A real Sherman weighs 33 tons. Simonson watches as two privates connect an air compressor to the valve assembly and flip the switch. The rubber begins to expand. Around him, officers from the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops watch in silence. Some cross their arms. Others glance at each other with expressions that suggest they've been transferred to the wrong unit by mistake. Captain George Vander Sluys, an architect from Philadelphia before the war, studies the inflation process with the careful attention of someone trying to understand a bad idea before it gets worse. The tank takes shape slowly. Turret. Hull. Tracks. When the compressor shuts off 20 minutes later, a full-size Sherman replica stands in the snow. From 50 feet away, it looks absurd. The rubber surface wrinkles in the wind. The turret wobbles slightly. When Private Harold Dahl leans against it to catch his breath, the entire side panel buckles inward. "Well," Simonson says quietly. "That's what we're working with." No one laughs. No one speaks. The army has assembled 1,100 men to fight with illusions instead of weapons. Artists from art schools, engineers from universities, actors from theater companies, fashion designers, photographers, architects. Their average IQ is 119. Their average combat experience is 0. The concept originated in British deception operations in North Africa, where dummy tanks fooled Rommel's reconnaissance aircraft into misidentifying Allied strength and positions. Montgomery's staff had arranged entire fake military installations, plywood artillery, painted canvas vehicles, dummy supply depots, that convinced German intelligence they were facing forces that didn't exist. It worked. German commanders diverted troops to counter phantom divisions. Real Allied units attacked where the enemy wasn't looking. When captured German intelligence documents revealed how thoroughly they'd been deceived, Allied command decided to replicate the operation on a larger scale. The Americans would need their own deception unit. Something mobile. Something that could simulate entire divisions, complete with visual displays, radio traffic, and sound effects. Something that could make the Germans believe 30,000 men were preparing to attack when only 1,100 were actually present. Thus the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Thus the rubber tanks. But as Simonson watches the inflatable Sherman sway in the January wind, he understands the fundamental problem facing this operation. Deception requires the enemy to believe what they're seeing. If German observers spot one detail that looks wrong, a tank that moves too easily, armor that ripples in the breeze, tracks that don't leave deep impressions in soft ground, the entire illusion collapses. And in combat, when illusions collapse, people die. Sergeant Victor Dowd, a painter who studied at Pratt Institute, approaches the inflatable tank and taps it with his knuckles. The sound is hollow, unconvincing. He steps back and looks at Simonson. "Sir, how close do the Germans need to be before they realize this isn't real?" Simonson doesn't answer immediately. The question contains the entire operational challenge in a single sentence. Too close, and the deception fails. Too far, and the Germans won't pay attention. The unit needs to position themselves where enemy observers can see them clearly enough to identify American armor, but not so clearly that they notice the armor is made of rubber held together with bicycle pumps. Close enough to believe, Simonson finally says. Not close enough to verify. The distinction measures roughly 500 yards. Within that range, German observers through field glasses should see American tank formations. Beyond that range, details blur. Below that range, the deception becomes obvious. The men begin to understand what they're being asked to do. They will deploy within visual range of enemy positions. They will inflate equipment that looks dangerous from a distance but wouldn't stop a rifle bullet. They will draw enemy attention deliberately, making themselves targets to divert German forces from actual threats. They will be bait. Private James Anderson, an auto mechanic from Virginia, writes in his diary that night, "We're going to war with toys. If the Germans find out, we're dead." The training intensifies through winter into spring. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers practice inflating dummy equipment until they can assemble a complete tank battalion in under 4 hours. The signal company special learns to mimic radio traffic patterns from real armored divisions, copying the rhythm and phrasing of authentic military communications. The 3132nd Signal Service Company develops sonic deception, recordings of tank engines, construction equipment, troop movements, played through speakers powerful enough to be heard miles away. Each element must work together. Radio traffic suggests military units. Visual displays confirm their presence. Sound effects add authenticity. Any inconsistency, any detail that doesn't align, and German intelligence will recognize the deception. The pressure builds slowly. In March, advance officers fly to England to coordinate with British deception operations already underway for the Normandy invasion. In April, the main force sails across the Atlantic. By May, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops are bivouacked near Stratford-upon-Avon, still training, still practicing, still wondering if rubber tanks will actually fool anyone. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces land at Normandy. The Ghost Army, as they're beginning to call themselves, isn't there. They're still in England, inflating practice tanks, waiting for their chance to prove the concept works. The first men die at Normandy. Real men in real tanks, fighting real battles. The Ghost Army listens to casualty reports and wonders when they'll get their turn. Some feel guilty about not being in the invasion. Others feel relieved. Most simply feel uncertain. Because no one really knows if this will work. Normandy, France. June 23, 1944. The landing zone still smells of cordite. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops arrive 2 weeks after D-Day, disembarking from transport ships into a combat zone that's simultaneously chaotic and organized. Burned-out German pillboxes line the beaches. Destroyed vehicles rust in the surf. Medics still carry wounded men from aid stations to hospital ships. Supply officers direct traffic through improvised roads. The Ghost Army sets up camp near the beachhead. Around them, real military units prepare for the push inland, infantry divisions, armored columns, artillery battalions. The contrast is immediate and uncomfortable. Other units carry heavy weapons, ammunition stockpiles, combat equipment. The 23rd carries inflatable rubber, radio transmitters, and sound trucks. When regular infantry soldiers ask what unit they're with, the Ghost Army men learn to give vague answers. Headquarters Special Troops. Tactical deception. The explanations usually end conversations quickly. No one wants to admit they fight with fake equipment. But 3 days after arriving, on June 26, they receive their first real mission. Lieutenant Colonel Simonson gathers his officers in a command tent near Carentan. The briefing is direct. Allied intelligence knows German reconnaissance aircraft fly regular patterns over the American sector. Hitler's commanders need to understand Allied strength and positioning. The Ghost Army will give them something to see. Operation Elephant. Simulate the presence of the 2nd Armored Division moving south from Carentan toward St. Lo. Make the Germans believe an entire armored division, 15,000 men, 300 tanks, is preparing for a major offensive. The actual 2nd Armored Division is repositioning elsewhere. If the deception works, German forces will strengthen defenses in the wrong location. The Ghost Army has 48 hours to create a division that doesn't exist. They move out after dark on June 27. Convoy discipline is perfect, blackout lights only, minimal radio traffic, intervals between vehicles maintained exactly. They bivouac in fields and orchards south of Carentan, spreading out across several square miles to create the appearance of a dispersed armored formation. At dawn on June 28, the inflation begins. Sergeant Bob Tompkins, who joined the unit in Tennessee and trained through winter, positions himself beside a collapsed inflatable Sherman. He's done this dozens of times in training. Now, for the first time, German observers are watching. Somewhere beyond the hedge rows, perhaps in a church steeple or farmhouse attic, enemy scouts are noting American movements through field glasses. The compressor starts. The rubber expands. 20 minutes later, an M4 Sherman stands in the Norman grass. Tompkins and his team inflate 15 more tanks before noon. Other teams set up dummy tank destroyers, half-tracks, supply vehicles. By early afternoon, a visual survey from any elevated position would show extensive American armor concentrated south of Carentan. The sonic crews position their speakers in tree lines and behind hedgerows. At 1,400 hours, they begin playing recordings. Tank engines idling. Sergeants shouting orders. Construction equipment moving. The sounds carry across the countryside, suggesting a large military unit conducting maintenance and preparation. Radio operators establish network traffic matching 2nd Armored Division patterns, frequency shifts, call signs, message volumes, encryption protocols. They don't send actual orders, they create the impression of command structure operating at divisional scale. Everything looks right. Everything sounds right. From 500 yards away, through field glasses, an observer would see American armored forces preparing for combat operations. But then, something unexpected happens. German artillery begins ranging fire. Not heavy bombardment, just exploratory shells, the kind artillery officers use to calibrate distances and test defensive positions. The first rounds land 400 yards short. The second volley lands 200 yards beyond the Ghost Army positions. The third volley splits the difference. Lieutenant Fred Fox, commanding one of the forward deception teams, realizes what's happening. The Germans see what looks like an American armored division. They're registering target coordinates. If they decide to launch a serious bombardment, the Ghost Army has no armor protection, no bunkers, no heavy weapons to return fire. Just inflatable rubber. Fox orders his men to dig foxholes immediately. Around him, soldiers who trained as artists and designers now scramble into the earth with entrenching tools, understanding for the first time that deception operations exist within artillery range of enemy guns. The shells continue sporadically through the afternoon, ranging fire, testing, confirming. The Germans are paying attention. That night, Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft fly over the American sector. The Ghost Army has positioned their dummy equipment in realistic tactical formations, dispersed enough to suggest good field craft, concentrated enough to indicate operational strength. They've parked real vehicles, jeeps, trucks, command cars, among the inflatable dummies to add authenticity. From 3,000 feet altitude in fading light, the distinction between real and fake becomes impossible to determine. The reconnaissance photographs are developed somewhere in German intelligence offices. Analysts count tanks, estimate strength, prepare reports for commanders who are trying to understand Allied intentions. According to those reports, the 2nd Armored Division is positioned near Carentan, preparing for offensive operations toward St. Lo. German defensive forces adjust accordingly. Units shift. Reserves reposition. Artillery targets update. And none of it is real. Operation Elephant runs for 4 days. The Ghost Army maintains the illusion, inflating equipment each morning, deflating and hiding it each night, running radio traffic, playing sound effects, creating the persistent impression of an armored division that's actually elsewhere. On July 2nd, they pack up and move out. The 2nd Armored Division has completed its actual repositioning. The deception mission is complete. 3 days later, Allied intelligence reviews captured German documents. Enemy commanders had diverted 2 infantry regiments to counter the perceived armored threat near Carentan. Those regiments weren't available when the real American offensive began at St. Lo. The rubber tanks fooled them. Completely. The Rhine River, March 1945. The war is nearly over, but no one knows that yet. The 9th Army prepares to cross the last major natural barrier before Germany's industrial heartland. If the crossing fails, the war extends into summer, maybe longer. Allied commanders need every advantage. They need the Germans looking in the wrong direction when American forces hit the water. They call the Ghost Army Operation Viersen. The largest deception operation of the European war. Make the Germans believe the Rhine crossing will occur at Viersen, 15 miles north of the actual crossing site at Rheinberg. Convince enemy intelligence that 2 full corps, 60,000 men, hundreds of tanks, massive artillery support, are assembling for a northern assault. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops has conducted 21 deception operations since Normandy. They've simulated divisions in Brittany, Luxembourg, Belgium. They've created phantom armored columns that drew German forces away from actual breakthrough points. They've lost 3 men killed and 30 wounded, mostly from artillery fire landing too close to their forward positions. They know how this works now. They know what they're capable of. They know the risks. And they know Operation Viersen is different from anything they've attempted before. For days to create an entire army that doesn't exist. For days to set up over 600 inflatable vehicles, tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, tank destroyers, all positioned where German observation posts can see them. For days to establish radio networks suggesting corps-level command structure. For days to run sonic deception continuously, making it sound like massive troop concentrations are building. For days to be perfect. The operation begins March 18. The Ghost Army splits into multiple task forces, each responsible for simulating specific units. They inflate dummy equipment in realistic tactical formations, maintenance areas, supply dumps, command posts, bivouac sites. Everything must look lived in, operational, authentic. The radio operators transmit thousands of messages across military frequencies. Corps headquarters communicating with division commanders. Division commanders coordinating with regimental staff. Battalion networks handling logistics. The traffic patterns match standard U.S. Army procedures exactly, message volumes, encryption protocols, transmission intervals. The sonic trucks position themselves in tree lines overlooking the Rhine. Beginning March 19, they play recordings 24 hours per day. Tank movements. Heavy equipment. Construction. Troop activity. The sounds carry across the river. German positions on the eastern bank can hear American forces assembling. Everything is in place. The illusion is complete. On March 20, German artillery begins sustained bombardment of Ghost Army positions. Heavy fire, 88 mm guns, 105 mm howitzers. The shells come in salvos, targeting the areas where inflatable tanks stand in neat formations. Direct hit on a dummy Sherman. The rubber explodes in fragments. Direct hit on an inflatable half-track. Shredded material catches fire. The sonic trucks shut down and pull back. The radio operators break down their antennas and move to secondary positions. And while the Germans pound the northern sector with everything they have, real American forces cross the Rhine at Rheinberg, 15 miles south. The actual assault begins at 0200 hours on March 24. By dawn, American troops have established bridgeheads on the eastern bank. German commanders, realizing they've been watching the wrong sector, scramble to redirect forces. But the crossings have already succeeded. The Rhine barrier is broken. It costs the Ghost Army dearly. 37 men wounded in the artillery bombardment. Equipment destroyed. Vehicles damaged. Captain Oscar Seal takes shrapnel in his leg while supervising the inflation of dummy artillery. Private Harold Dahl suffers a concussion when a shell lands 30 yards from his foxhole. But the deception worked. German intelligence committed forces to defend against an attack that never came. Allied casualties at the actual crossing point were significantly lower than projected. The war moves into Germany. The Ghost Army deflates what remains of their equipment and moves east, following real combat units deeper into German territory. They conduct 3 more operations before Germany surrenders in May. Each time, they inflate rubber tanks. Each time, they broadcast fake radio traffic. Each time, they play sound effects suggesting military units that aren't there. Each time, the Germans believe them. After the surrender, captured German officers are interviewed about Allied deception operations. Most express disbelief when shown photographs of inflatable tanks. Several insist the photographs must be propaganda, that American forces wouldn't rely on such crude tricks. General der Panzertruppe Walter Kruger, who commanded forces near the Rhine, reviews the intelligence reports his staff prepared during Operation Viersen. The reports confidently assessed American strength at Viersen as 2 corps with extensive armored support. When told the formations were entirely fake, Kruger sits quietly for several minutes. "We never suspected," he says finally. "Not once." The mathematics of deception are brutal and simple. 1,100 men with inflatable equipment drew German attention and forces away from actual Allied operations. The German commanders diverted real infantry, real armor, real artillery to counter threats that existed only as rubber, radio signals, and sound recordings. Those diverted forces weren't available where American soldiers actually attacked. Battles that might have lasted days ended in hours. Casualties that might have reached thousands stayed in hundreds. Strategic positions that might have been defended successfully fell quickly. All because the Germans were looking at rubber tanks. Fort Drum, New York. September 1945. The war is over. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops gathers one final time before disbanding. No parade. No ceremony. Just men collecting equipment, filling out discharge papers, preparing to return to lives interrupted by war. In a warehouse, deflated rubber tanks sit in collapsed piles, waiting to be disposed of or stored in some military depot where they'll be forgotten. The inflatable Shermans that fooled German reconnaissance aircraft, that drew enemy artillery fire, that helped Allied forces cross the Rhine, they're just rubber now. Curious objects. Relics of a strange chapter in military history. Victor Dowd, the painter from Pratt Institute, walks among the collapsed dummies one last time. He remembers inflating his first tank in the snow at Pine Camp. He remembers the skepticism in other soldiers' faces. He remembers thinking this would never work. But it did work. Over and over. 21 deception operations across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, Germany. The Ghost Army simulated 10 divisions, 2 corps headquarters, and dozens of smaller units. They spent an average of 5 days per operation creating elaborate illusions that German intelligence consistently believed were real. The casualty ratio tells the story more clearly than any after-action report. In nearly 2 years of operations, the Ghost Army lost 3 men killed and 37 wounded. Most conventional combat units suffered worse casualties in single engagements. The deception mission, despite positioning men within artillery range of enemy guns, proved less deadly than direct combat. But the success came with its own weight. Sergeant Bob Tompkins, who inflated tanks outside Brest while German observers watched from church towers, struggles with strange guilt after the war. He didn't fire a rifle. Didn't storm a beach. Didn't fight in the traditional sense. What he did was inflate rubber and play pretend while other men died attacking real German positions. Except his pretending made those attacks succeed with fewer casualties. His rubber tanks drew German forces away from American soldiers. His fake radio transmissions convinced enemy commanders to make fatal strategic mistakes. He saved lives by lying successfully. This bothers him for reasons he can't fully articulate. There's something unsettling about fighting a war with tricks instead of weapons. Something uncomfortable about survival being tied to successful deception rather than courage under fire. Military historians later calculate that Ghost Army operations may have saved between 15,000 and 30,000 Allied casualties, lives preserved because German forces were positioned to counter threats that didn't exist. The inflatable equipment, which seemed absurd in training at Pine Camp, proved more effective than anyone anticipated. The concept influences military thinking for decades afterward. Deception becomes a formal component of operational planning. Future conflicts employ sophisticated methods, decoy installations, electronic warfare, psychological operations, all descended from that initial experiment with rubber tanks and sound effects. But the men who actually conducted those operations rarely talk about it after the war. The Ghost Army's activities remain classified for decades. When they gather for reunions in later years, they discover that even their families often didn't know what they'd done during the war. Special troops, they'd said vaguely. Tactical operations. The full story emerges slowly. Documents are declassified. Photographs surface. Historians piece together the operational record. By the time the public learns about inflatable tanks fooling Hitler's army, most of the men who inflated those tanks are elderly or dead. In 2013, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops receives the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor Congress can award. The few surviving veterans attend the ceremony in Washington. They're in their 90s now. They shake hands with politicians who praise their creativity and courage. One veteran, in an interview afterward, says something that captures the strange nature of what they did. "We weren't heroes," he says. "We were artists who got drafted. They gave us rubber tanks and told us to make the Germans believe. So we did. We made them believe." In modern warfare, deception operations are sophisticated and technical: satellite imagery manipulation, radar spoofing, cyber operations. But they all trace back to that fundamental principle the Ghost Army proved in 1944. If you can make the enemy believe something false, you control what they do in response. You shape their decisions. You determine where they position their forces, what they defend, what they attack. Truth becomes less important than conviction. The Germans were convinced American armored divisions threatened Viersen. They committed forces accordingly. The rubber tanks were never meant to withstand scrutiny. They only needed to be believed long enough to matter. And they were. The inflatable Shermans are gone now, disposed of, destroyed, lost to history. But the concept they represented persists. Modern military deception draws on lessons learned by men who inflated rubber in Norman fields while German artillery bracketed their positions. Those men understood something fundamental about war. Combat isn't just about destroying the enemy's forces. It's about controlling the enemy's decisions. And sometimes, the most effective way to control decisions is to show people what they expect to see, even when what they're seeing isn't real. They laughed at inflatable tanks in January 1944, standing in the snow at Pine Camp, watching rubber wobble in the wind. By March 1945, at the Rhine, no one was laughing anymore. The Germans had panicked. They'd repositioned forces, committed reserves, diverted artillery to counter American armor that existed only as air and rubber. Real Allied soldiers crossed the river while enemy commanders stared at ghosts. And in that moment, deception proved as decisive as any weapon ever forged.